The Last of Us Part 2 was probably the game that really capped off the previous generation of consoles, as well as being one of the most technologically impressive. It is almost weird looking back on just how excited everyone was for this game when it was announced at the PSX event back in 2016. However, fast forward just over 4 years later and things have changed. After 7 years of anticipation, development, and controversy, the game finally came out, and was met with one of the most extreme reactions the gaming industry has ever seen. Personally, I enjoyed the game greatly. I managed to avoid the spoilers and story details up until the game's launch. But I did look into the game's production at the time since it was a major story worth being informed over, and it's clear that while the game didn't quite dip into development hell, as it had a clear goal as to what it wanted to be as a product, it did indulge in the next worst thing. The Last of Us was a surprisingly large hit when it released in 2013, even to Naughty Dog itself, as they were riding high on the success of the Uncharted series. According to Neil Druckmann, the director at Naughty Dog, creating a new IP was expecting lower attention in sales, as well as the game being a slower pace and a more subtle story focusing on characters rather than the bombastic set pieces everyone was used to, as well as having gameplay that was more about hanging on to your resources and slowly pushing through halls filled with infected and hostile humans, as compared to shooting down helicopters, blowing up trains, and fighting through lost cities and sinking deserts. What Druckmann expected was the opposite of what really happened. Even though The Last of Us was created as a slower-paced story filled with morally gray scenarios with characters you don't always agree with, it still proceeded to sweep players off their feet. It took away over 200 Game of the Year awards, and it put Naughty Dog on the map as one of Sony's major developers if they weren't already one before. It pretty much turned them into a household name overnight. After they released the remastered port for PS4, development began on The Last of Us Part 2 in 2014, even as the team was midway with creating Uncharted 4, also helmed by Neil Druckmann as the director. However, this wouldn't be the first time Naughty Dog split their development team. The Last of Us itself was created at the same time as Uncharted 3, though Uncharted was released before The Last of Us was even announced. This time was different, however. Instead of two teams being fully dedicated to a project at a time, a majority of Naughty Dog was on board for Uncharted 4, while a smaller team was setting the foundation of what would be the new post-apocalyptic title. Uncharted 4 was released in 2016, and afterwards it was all hands on deck for the next chapter of Ellie and Joel's adventure. The game was revealed in 2016 with an announcement trailer, though it was a vague one that intentionally left room for speculation. Something vaguely terrible has happened, and has upset Ellie to the point of finding and killing whoever did it. And it was in this reveal trailer that the impact of the first game was truly felt. In the span of a single game, the iconography and symbolism within it became a mainstay. Before any title or character was shown, the symbol from the in-game faction, the Fireflies, was shown. And this was the reaction to just seeing that. While anticipation was high, the game would mostly go silent from then until 2018, where they revealed a gameplay trailer, showing improvements to AI, combat, and NPC interactions, as well as showing the state Ellie is in more subtle ways that shows up in the story. In the first few scenes, she is oddly disconnected, disassociative even. While she clearly cares about the people around her, there's a piece of her that just feels off, which goes away once the next scene begins. She feels oddly in her prime as she is slicing her way through cultists and soldiers to the still unknown revenge mission. Little did anyone know, the game would go silent for another year besides a few interviews, once promising a darker story and tone that everyone might not agree with, but it's the story they want to tell. But another trailer was unveiled soon after, revealing that the game was set to release in February 21st, 2020. This release date didn't last long. A short time later, it was delayed a few months to release in May 29th, the reason being to polish the game and make sure it was completely ready to release. As this was happening, however, Jason Schreier was finishing a report on Naughty Dog itself, and this is where I will be getting into Naughty Dog's insane crunch problem, one that I can only hope has gone away, but I have my reservations. Later in this video, I will be reviewing the game itself isolated from production issues, but I want to make my position clear. Naughty Dog's style of development is absolutely unacceptable. They were known to be one of the worst gaming studios to work for in how they treat employees. Work weeks stretched to 100 hours. Between development of Uncharted 4 and The Last of Us Part 2, 70% of non-lead designers left the studio due to the grueling hours expected of them. It got so bad that nearing release, Naughty Dog had to hire film animators because none of the gaming animators wanted to work for them. Their reputation at this point was known, and the crunch was only getting worse. Crunch itself is a culture in the gaming industry, and just in 2019, Schreier released an article on BioWare about the studio's crunch on Anthem. It's a familiar story about a hopeful, mostly young developers being brought in, expecting passion and creativity, and being overworked to the point where they were actually hospitalized. That is not a joke. They suffered workplace casualties, something that was previously referred to when soldiers could not work or function properly due to the impacts of war and PTSD. However, this culture is pervasive in the AAA space, and it is not exclusive to BioWare and EA. This happened at Naughty Dog too. Some studios may say that you don't need to crunch, but it is absolutely expected when you read between the lines. If you aren't willing to crunch and to give every waking hour you can to the company you will be working for and then some, you will be replaced, and they will find someone else who will. Schreier says it best in his investigative report on The Last of Us Part 2. At Naughty Dog, nobody asks the developers to crunch. Nobody has to ask. They'll be there anyway. Creating the vertical slice seen in the E3 2018 demo was allegedly the worst crunch any of the team had been tasked with creating. They required weeks of recovery and hospitalization afterwards. Burning through talent caused the game to lose traction quickly. While it eventually did come out, it came at the cost of time and people's health. A former animator for Naughty Dog, Jonathan Cooper, brought up a concerning point. Due to both the fresh talent and senior talent being pushed out for the sake of their mental and physical health, the game's development slowed to a crawl. A more senior team would have released the game a year prior. This is an intense problem, one that we can only hope stops at Naughty Dog now that such a huge portion of their staff has been driven away, but it almost feels like it's insane to say that this was not the end of their development issues. The game was beginning to prepare to release when a certain worldly event suddenly hit, halting production in some cases and forcing many to work from home. May 29th's release date was shifted into an indefinite delay. According to some, development was actually finished with the game going gold not too long before, but while one can only speculate the reason, one of the main theories is that Sony didn't want to risk launching during the very bad thing that was happening. Instead, simply waiting to release it once they felt it was most financially viable. Hearing the delay was indefinite scared some, but in reality, players would only have to wait one more month. But once more, it doesn't end there. In the midst of the wait, the worst case scenario went live. Major portions of the game and the plot were leaked online by a hacker, including character deaths, one of the major twists, and the general direction of the story. I managed to personally avoid these spoilers, but it was insane how this happened. What was more insane was the community reaction. While I didn't participate, seeing others react harshly was jarring. Suddenly the game was no good, the story was awful, and the direction was worthless, and that was really confusing for people talking about a game that didn't come out yet, and they were just reacting to scenes that were taken completely out of context. But sure. Gamers. I didn't want to know anything about it, but I finally played the game the literal second it was released on June 19th, 2020, and it was a lot. Before talking about the story and spoiler content, I do want to knock out the gameplay first, since that is what I can analyze without spoiling anything about the game's narrative and what it really contains. The game plays very similarly to The Last of Us 1, but with a lot more polish. Rather than feeling restricted, the game's designs and characters feel more free to interact with the environment. Players can crawl through small holes in the wall to narrowly escape danger. Levels are more open in design, creating adrenaline-rushing moments and dynamic chases. Enemies will cry out for their fallen as they are picked off, leaving an uneasy yet gratifying feeling when you take them out one by one. While a younger version of myself would have praised The Last of Us 1 with a 10 out of 10, that was mainly for the story. My only real praises of the gameplay were its pacing, progression, and how it tied into the themes of the larger world. After playing Part 2, it's difficult to go back. The idea of the first game, but with the second game's control, gunplay, and level design sounds like a wonderful experience, though it isn't one I want to see personally, and I'd rather have that budget and time allocated toward a new IP and experience, rather than revisiting something familiar with, oh goddamn. Overall, the gameplay is the best out of any of the Naughty Dog games. I would legitimately play a game mode that was purely sneaking around or just fighting enemies with this gameplay. Maybe not forever, but I would still have a good time with it, especially when we end up getting the factions multiplayer. Weapons are satisfying to fire, crafting feels much more relevant and intense in the middle of a fight, and there are a few dynamic surprises I won't spoil into the story section, which is right now. This section will contain spoilers for the game. In the description you will find a timestamp to skip straight over to the conclusion if you intend on playing this game for yourself still. Which, to cut to the chase, I do recommend. Well, if you can afford a magical $200 box, that is. The Last of Us 2 story is almost the opposite of the first game's, and likely intentionally. The first game was defined by the relationship of Joel and Ellie. It was a brighter game despite the carnage, with undertones and hints of darkness creeping under it. Part 2 is a game defined by the absence of Joel and Ellie's relationship, where torturing, suffer, and hatred are at the forefront. But in the midst of that, you are also shown the better impulses of humanity and how it arises from the worst conditions. The separation in tone is done in various ways, through its marketing, the story itself, and even the soundtrack. Comparing both of the game's theme song is where it is most obvious. Where Last of Us 1's theme is more orchestral, hopeful, and adventurous, The Last of Us 2's theme takes the same structure and makes it feel more dark and empty. It isn't hard to see why the beginning was controversial. Getting attached to a character over the course of the first game and spending 7 years wondering where he will go next no doubt led to some high expectations. Expectations that were torturously taken away as he was beaten to death at the start, all while his surrogate daughter watched. I actually enjoyed Joel's death, and even more over time. Well, okay, I didn't enjoy it. I cried at 3 a.m. with half a cookie hanging out of my mouth, but it made me want to see where the story was going. I felt properly cheated out of seeing Joel and get to settle down and feel safe, and I wanted to know what drove these people to killing him, which is exactly what Ellie pursues. That, and now nothing was off the table. It did give a general feeling that the story could go anywhere and nobody was going to be spared, no matter their status as a beloved character. While I had some issues with how the game was paced initially, it is clear that it is done like this for a reason. When you start the story, you are likely right there with Ellie. You don't know much about these people, but you're wanting to learn why they killed Joel and return the favor. But as you play, flashbacks play out, where you learn that the finale of the first game drove a wedge between the two and destabilized their relationship. This also contains one of my favorite subtle touches to the game. When asked what Joel did at the start by Tommy, he describes the event as,
I saved her.
But when having to tell it to Ellie, he can no longer sugarcoat it. He words it just slightly differently.
So I stopped them.
Seeing this shakes the player's faith a bit. We see Ellie have her heart broken when Joel finally admits that he killed Marlene and stopped the surgery, and you wonder why she would go on such a terrible mission that is risking her own life and the life of her friends for someone she says she never wants to see again, as well as becoming disillusioned the more grotesque her mission becomes. The game very intentionally wedges the players and Ellie's relationship apart. Ellie manages to kill off just about everyone in Abby's squad, and just as the disconnect between Ellie and the player is strongest, Abby shows up.
You killed my friends. We let you both live, and you wasted it!
The game then rewinds 3 days, and you play through the timeline of events through Abby's perspective. You learn firsthand that the reason Abby went after Joel is because he killed her father at the end of the first game. The point of this section isn't exactly to get you to love Abby as a character, but to get you to understand her. You understand why she went after Joel, and you see the consequences it has on herself and all of her friends. She causes most of them to die by inspiring Ellie to hunt them down. She ends up ruining her relationship with Owen, and she still has the same nightmares she started having when her dad was first killed. In the end, killing Joel did nothing. All she did was lose her humanity in the process. I also do appreciate that what Joel did at the end of the first game isn't totally cast in a different light. Depending on who you asked, you could justify the scene, or you could totally condemn Joel. You could say that he took away Ellie's purpose and that he killed people just doing their jobs for the hope of humanity. Or you could argue that the Fireflies were totally incompetent and that trusting them with handling a cure that comes at the expense of a person you love isn't worth it, especially when you don't get a say in the matter and leaving you no choice but to respond violently. No matter what you thought of Joel, this new perspective on the event doesn't suddenly change that. It only aims to flesh it out, see it from new angles, and show you the deeper cost that was previously missed. I can honestly praise the game for managing to do this with something that, on paper, is as simple as a character death. Joel's death manages to serve as dramatic consequences for his actions at the end of the first game, is the inciting incident for this game, and ties it both together. This one event is pretty much catastrophic in all the damage it inflicts on everyone, and then proceeds to motivate everyone in different directions until their paths intersect, and they have developed and reacted differently to the same event. And listen, I'm sorry if you disagree with me, but this one event managing to motivate and tie in everything from the previous game and push forward the plot of this one like that, that's prime good sequel writing. As you progress through Abby's section, she eventually comes across Yara and Lev, 2 runaway kids from the rival faction that she and every other soldier had been ordered to shoot on sight. But since they save her, they work together and eventually establish a relationship. And honestly, Lev and Abby bonding together and growing as characters together is the highlight of this game for me. You see so much depressing shit in this game as enemies beg for their lives and mourn for their friends in real time, and you still try to recover from Joel's death. But seeing Lev still have some semblance of innocence really helps motivate not only the player, but Abby to grow. She starts to seem more human again as she takes care of him, and they teach each other about what they both learned from their perspectives, tying into the larger theme about learning to understand one another and move past grief. Lev learns about technology, modern slang, and what it's really like to have a family that is willing to fight for you after being driven out from his old one. And Abby, after pretty much losing her humanity, regains it. She becomes a mother figure for Lev. Wow, I wonder who that could be a foil to. Her nightmares start to fade once she finds a new purpose, and she even opens her mind to the cult that Lev was from. She learns to see them as dangerous enemies, but ultimately human. She even becomes willing to turn on her own army for the sake of protecting Lev, even if she thinks it would kill her. Meanwhile, Ellie continues her mission to avenge Joel at the cost of herself and her loved ones. But she isn't painted as a villain for doing so. Instead, you understand her the same way you understand Abby. She fights tooth and nail for something that you can understand is wrong, but you can get why, especially if you were all on board with her mission toward the start. On the topic of characters doing something wrong, a lot of the criticism I see of the game seems to miss the point. Mainly the one being that if the player had no choice, then why should they feel bad about what happens, which on the surface level is sound, but that isn't the game's intention and can quickly fall away with a little speculation. For example, why should I feel bad about Sarah's death? I didn't get a choice in the matter. I don't care. Yeah, it's kind of stupid. It's a linear game, it's telling a linear story. It's not about your choices. The game doesn't seek to criticize or berate the player either. It aims to show the worst flaws of these characters, and you just happen to be in the driver's seat. Killing a dog in the QTE didn't feel flashy or shocking to me personally because I didn't immediately think the game was trying to pull a fast one over my own morality. I understood it as Ellie fighting whatever was in her way to progress to her goal, and also a dog was attacking me, I'm going to defend myself. One of my favorite games, Spec Ops: The Line, uses the same methods of storytelling. The player doesn't often get a choice in committing the worst acts, and when they do, it has little impact on the story. As who you spare instead of kill comes with the implication that they're doomed anyways. The characters' mistakes in that game aren't painted as the players, just as it isn't here. The lack of choice has more to do with them wanting to tell a specific story with these people, not because they wanted you to be fooled into feeling bad for something that you couldn't back down from. And narratively, that makes sense as it only progresses the player's disconnect from Ellie's mission. The player's relationship with the protagonist is the most fascinating part of this game, and I really enjoyed how the game structured itself in order to employ that. I also used to think that the last hour of the game was useless and it could have been cut and have everything wrap up earlier, but now looking back, I think it was very much necessary. Ellie, Dina, and Tommy all return home beaten, broken, but they all get to live and have a chance to move on. But lacking closure, Ellie and Tommy are haunted by this. Tommy sustains long-lasting injuries from Seattle and can't exact vengeance on Abby himself, so he's left to stir on his own, unsatisfied guilt and anger, and resorts to the only thing he can do, lay that guilt on Ellie. It is honestly disheartening to see someone who values family so much end up having those values twisted and turn him into a spiteful old man who is willing to do the worst, just to finally achieve what he thinks will help him find closure. And Ellie even feels it. She has traumatic flashbacks. Guilt over not being there for Joel sinks in. And just like Abby, she can't eat, she can't sleep, and the only dreams she has, she describes as tormenting nightmares. And then the ultimate confrontation. The Ellie and Abby fight is brutal, painful, and personal. They bite, scar, and rip each other apart. But then finally, Ellie has her, and she has the chance to end it. And just before she totally loses herself, she thinks back to the final moment with the person she had been doing this for. The moment where she decided to forgive him and move on. And she decides, screw it. The best thing to do is to do the same for Abby. Forgiving doesn't always mean being friends with the enemy, but it can be just letting them walk away. Because obsessing over the pain and finally indulging it would probably cause Ellie to lose her humanity forever. One of my favorite parts about the ending is where she lets go of Abby and says,
"No. Just take him."
And that she isn't talking about Lev there. When Ellie returns, she can no longer play the guitar, the last gift from Joel she really has. It's a bit twisted, but it serves as the conclusion to that theme that has been permeating throughout the game, and especially at the end. She leaves the guitar behind in her house as she sets out again, finally letting go of everything that happened. It's definitely depressing, but in the long run, it's best for her and everyone around her. She finally gets to let go of Joel and move on from that terrible moment of her life. The game does a really good job at conveying a cycle as well. Abby starts off willing to do anything to get back at Joel. She basically turns herself into a walking weapon. But after a while, she becomes Joel. She finally finds true closure from her trauma, and even if it's too late to resolve it peacefully, she found it. This goes as far as Ellie being able to use her knife to stealth kill, but Abby requiring shivs just like Joel did. Meanwhile, Ellie becomes Abby at the start of the game, angry, guilty, and wanting nothing more than to kill the person who wronged her, while not knowing the best path forward really is the painful process of letting go and dealing with that trauma directly. Even Joel goes through this process, though mostly off-screen. When Sarah died, he didn't have anyone to blame. The person who did it already died. So he took it out on the world for a good few years and nearly ruined his relationship with Tommy, and likely lost a lot of friends along the way until he settled with Tess and Bill. In the end, the cycles the characters go through are the highlight of this game, in both obvious and subtle ways. My only real complaint with the game's story is that sometimes it doesn't go as hard as I wish it did with the themes. I would have liked it if Jesse more strongly opposed the group's plan and called it out for the suicide mission it was, which really would have made him paying for their mistakes hit even harder. But overall, I think this game's story was a really entertaining one that leaves a lot of room for analyzing and was more than worth the wait. This is probably going to be a shorter section, just wrapping everything up I discussed, but The Last of Us Part 2 was a fun experience that I still think back to a year after playing it, and will probably continue to look back on. It's both a satisfying and a gut-wrenching story, leaving room for players to leave satisfied and dig deeper if they wish to. Overall, everything is settled, and I've gotten to think back on these characters, and I think it's a pretty solid 8 out of 10 if I were to formally review it. So yeah, there's my score. Put it on there, little sticker. There. I would love to revisit the series one day or see where else Naughty Dog takes these characters, but I also do wish that making this sort of game can take more time, just so it didn't come at the extreme cost of employees and their health. And I think that despite this game's upsides, that is important to mention, because we won't be getting great games for long with that sort of work structure. I can definitely understand if the story wasn't for you, and if you preferred something brighter with the characters you've come to love, but I really appreciated the unapologetically darker story that wasn't afraid to punch hard and break the typical revenge formula and examine it closely. Even if I didn't, I would certainly be hard-pressed to call this a badly written game. I like how every character loses more than they gain, but it's more about them coming to terms with that loss rather than getting even. Being able to tell the story that they wanted to tell, no matter who it might upset, was honestly something I appreciated after a lot of stuff taking a more formulaic route recently. Not to say that the story doesn't follow certain conventions, but it definitely kept me more invested than many other games that were considered groundbreaking narratively, but ultimately didn't totally sell me, even if I did enjoy them, because I could essentially feel where it was gonna go from scene one. But in the end, I did like finally having a game that examined trauma and hatred from this angle, and showing how that desire for closure can quickly be twisted into something darker if one lets it, while also showing the best parts of people and how it can come out when they are finally able to let go of that guilt. That sort of pain will never leave someone. They won't grow out of trauma, but you can grow around it, and sometimes that has to be enough. Hey everyone, thank you for listening. I hope you guys enjoyed this. I know it was a huge deviation from what I usually do, but I always wanted to make something like this on a bigger scale, and yeah, this was a lot of fun. I won't be doing it super often. If I do anything like this ever again, it won't be until like the far future. But I really enjoyed putting something out there like this. If you are interested in watching a playthrough of this game, there is a playlist in my channel called Stream Archives, and there I streamed the entirety of The Last of Us Part 2. So if you want to check it out there, you feel free. Or I'm sure there are like 0 commentary videos out there that just have the game itself, raw, unedited, like that, if you're that interested in just checking it out. Just again, thank you so much for listening. making it to the end of something this long is a hell of a thing these days. Especially when this video is probably closer to 30 minutes than the usual 8 to 10. So yeah, it's a lot, but I'm super grateful nonetheless. At the time, I am probably on vacation when this goes live, but I am currently recording it July 8th. And it has been a ride. I've been writing this video for a long time, and finally putting it together is just, it's very cathartic, especially when I've had these thoughts in my head over a year for a game like this. Anyways, again, thank you, and I want to give a special thanks to the following: Thea CH, Katori Rod, Lun Girl, Lee, Rachel Lee, Kitty243, Little T, Chicken Clendy, Sammy Samar, Alicia, Spud Muffin, Clarabelle Pagan, Ailswith, Username 45, Miyu, Adam, Tricky Bunnytail, Rebecca Reeves, Marcella, Cepheus, Violet Fry, and Dryas Shy. Those are all my patrons on the Diplomat and Higher tier, and if you want to join them, the Patreon link is in the description below. Also, do keep in mind that these are my patrons as of July 8th. I might be missing some people that join between now and the time that this audio or video is uploaded to YouTube. It's unfortunate. It's just the case with my vacation that I just want to make sure who's up here now is credited whenever I'm able to, as I cue these things and then go on vacation and just kick back and let it sort itself out. But anyways, thank you to everyone supporting me. It truly means a lot. I'm so grateful to be able to be doing this. That's the word. There we go. Bingo. But yeah, in the meantime, y'all stay safe, and I will see you guys next time.